Afternoon and welcome to the Labor Forum. You are tuned in to WRFG 89.3 FM here in Atlanta. We have had a lot of really stormy weather. I want to make sure everybody stays safe on their way home. Drive carefully. And I want to welcome all of you who are listening on your radio and those listening on your computer online. Those who have tuned in to WRFG through your mobile device, the app that is available at wrfg.org and in the App Store. And of course, those of you who are watching us live in the studio right now as we are doing the program by tuning into the Labor Forum YouTube channel. And you would see that Paul McLennan and I are sitting behind the desk. Our other co-host, Kenyon Beasley, is in Chicago at the American Postal Workers Union Convention, and we will be expecting a call later in the program from one of his co-workers who will give us an update on the Staples campaign, which we have discussed multiple times here on the program. I do want to make it a special thanks to all of you who pledged to the WRFG Summer Pledge Drive, and to always remind you that the station is always has open arms for any amount of money that you wish to contribute, particularly after you hear one of the great programs that take place here on WRFG 24 hours a day. If it so moves you that you feel that this station is worthy of continued support, we celebrated our 41st birthday 2 Saturdays ago. And we certainly would appreciate any financial support from you, our listeners. You can go on the website at wrfg.org. It's a safe, secure website. You can mail a check to 1083 Austin Avenue, Northeast in Atlanta, 30307. And what we really, really like is when people come on in and give us their money in person. It really makes us feel good to know that you are willing to actually come here, see some of us, and turn over some funds that'll keep the station on air. The opinions that are expressed on this program, though, may not necessarily be those of the Board of Directors, staff, or volunteers here at WRFG. So we've got a new format now with our 1-hour program, and that is that we start off with our labor headlines, and then Paul McLennan, retired amalgamated transit union worker, gives us a history update. He always has found such interesting things to let us know about the victories and the struggles of working people in this country and around the world. Then we will have an interview, as I said, over the phone with a postal worker who is a campaign organizer of the Staples Drive in California. And then our last segment, we're going to have a discussion with Teresa Gutierrez, who's calling in from California. And it's about the critical need for solidarity and how we build it. So let me start with labor headlines. I think I introduced myself. I'm Diane Mathowitz, retired auto worker, and seated next to me is Paul McLennan, as I said, retired amalgamated transit. So here we are, two retired workers who love to talk about and participate and support other workers' struggles. That's why we're here on air. So here's some of the labor headlines. On July 16th, just last week, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, known as EEOC, released new federal guidelines for pregnant workers. Unbelievably, this is the first time these guidelines have been updated in over 30 years. So, long time coming. The guidelines clarify that any form of workplace discrimination or harassment against pregnant workers by employers is a form of discrimination and therefore illegal. Employers are now prohibited from forcing pregnant workers to take leave. Rather, employers may have to provide light-duty jobs for these workers. The guidelines also say that parental leave has to be applied equally to men and women, granting fathers new benefits on the job. I am sure that for the many millions of workers out there, families, that this is, as I said, long time coming. There have been unbelievable amounts of complaints that have gone into the EEOC. It's actually what prompted these new guidelines about women, once they tell their employer that they're pregnant, They get fired. All of a sudden, they get written up. They may have had exemplary records, and all of a sudden, there's a problem, and they lose their jobs. So this is good news. In Mexico now, taking place today, is a hunger strike by maquiladora workers. And these are companies, U.S. companies, that set up plants just across the Mexican border. And there's just, mile after mile of these plants. And they usually pay very low wages, and very often they hire a lot of women. And Johnson Controls, which is ranked number 6 among the top 100 global auto suppliers with retail sales of, catch this, $22.52 billion in 2012, sold its factory to Visteon. This Visteon is the ranked 32nd corporation with a mere $6.86 billion in retail sales. Now, so there you are, companies making billions of dollars, but the workers, who get paid very little and are mostly women, have been cheated out of their wages during this sale and have launched a hunger strike to get what is rightfully theirs. And my last bit of news is really, something that I think affects me and I believe so many people around the world. With deadly conflicts taking place in multiple countries, devastating the lives of millions of working people and their families, from Afghanistan and Iraq to South Sudan and Nigeria to Ukraine and Syria. As working class people here in the U.S., we cannot remain silent about the U.S. policies which fund and cause this violence, nor the corporations that benefit from armament sales, stolen resources, and access to cheap labor. Much of the world has witnessed the horror of the Israeli war on Gaza over the last less than 3 weeks and responded with huge demonstrations in literally every country, from Afghanistan and Australia to Israel itself and the U.S., including here in Atlanta. Over this past weekend, tens and literally hundreds of thousands filled the streets, as I mentioned, in cities large and small, around the globe, demanding, "Let Palestine live." As of this morning, at least 530 Palestinians have been killed and thousands injured and tens of thousands displaced. Many of the dead are children, such as the 4 adolescents and a 9-month-old baby girl who died when their home was shelled in Rafah on Sunday. Today, this morning, a hospital in the town of Deir al-Balah, I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce it correctly, Deir al-Balah, was bombed with 4 reported killed and 60 wounded. This is not the only hospital that the Israelis have bombed, but this is the one that happened today. President Obama, the U.S. Congress, and even Governor Deal have all declared their full support for this war and for Israel. It is important that workers, their unions, and other organizations speak and act to end occupation and war. Over $3 billion in U.S. taxpayer money supplies Israel every year with the weaponry being used in this assault on the Palestinian people. Money, I hope we would all agree, that would be so much better spent on uplifting the human condition with good jobs, housing, healthcare, and education for all. And that's our headlines for today. And we'll move on now to Paul McLennan and This Week in Labor History. Hi, Paul.
Okay, thank you, Diane. This week, on July 26th, the Americans with Disabilities Act, known as the ADA, took effect in 1992. The law was passed by Congress in 1990 as a result of grassroots pressure from the disability rights movement. The law prohibits, under certain circumstances, discrimination based on disability. It requires employers to offer reasonable accommodations to qualified disabled employees and bans discrimination against such workers. The ADA is a wide-ranging civil rights law that affords similar protections against discrimination to Americans with disabilities as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Previous to passage of the ADA, people with disabilities could be refused service in public accommodations such as restaurants, Public sidewalks lacked curb ramps to allow access out of the street and traffic. Deaf people who went to the hospital often received no interpretation services, so their communication with medical professionals was limited at best. People with visual disabilities could easily have been refused access to ballots for voting. Public transit was only for people who could climb steps. The Americans Disabled for Accessible Public Transit, known as ADAPT, and other groups fought hard for the passage of the ADA and for the basic civil rights it provided. At the time, ADAPT's main goal was access to public bus transit. Getting around the community is a vital part of integrating into the mainstream of society. In 1990, the passage of the ADA seemed doubtful, so ADAPT organized a national action in Washington, D.C. that year. To illustrate what lack of access means to people with disabilities, ADAPT members got out of their wheelchairs to crawl up the steps of the U.S. Capitol building, which was inaccessible to the disabled, took over the Capitol Rotunda, and told congressional leaders that they should walk a mile in our shoes to see from our point of view why the ADA was so critical. Then, in a display of strength and their desire for recognition of humanity and equality, 101 protesters in wheelchairs chained themselves together and were arrested in the rotunda. This was the final impetus resulting in the passage of the ADA. Access to mainline buses was the first part of the legislation to take effect. Yet, even as they celebrated, ADAPT members felt that the institutional bias in long-term care was still a tremendous barrier to equality for people with disabilities. Many of those who fought so hard for the ADA were people who had to literally fight for their lives and freedom, to fight their way out of nursing homes or state institutions. They were the ones who dared to risk arrest, block buses, take over meetings, and put it all on the line to show that the disability community was not going to be refused basic human rights. Long-term care is, in many ways, particularly a women's rights issue. According to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, 68% of nursing facility residents are women. According to a 2003 National Alliance for Caregiving AARP survey, 6 out of 10 informal caregivers are women, and over 70% of paid caregivers are women, the majority women of color, and they get older each year, acquiring disabilities of their own. So ADAPT's Free Our People campaign was launched in support of the Community Choice Act. The concept is that people should have an equal and real choice as to how and where they receive services. They should have a say in what services they receive and the manner in which those are funded, through an agency or directly to the affected person. ADAPT and other disability rights organizations continue to participate in direct action. For example, the National Federation of the Blind has led the struggle against Goodwill Industries for paying wages as low as pennies per hour to workers with disabilities. Goodwill is one of the many nonprofit organizations that takes advantage of Section 14C of the Fair Labor Standards Act, an obscure provision that permits employers to pay workers with disabilities less than the federal minimum wage. For over 70 years, Section 14C of the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act has allowed employers to obtain special wage certificates that permit them to pay their workers with disabilities wages far less than the federal minimum. Disability rights are human rights, and the disability rights movement is an essential part of any movement for transformative change in this country.
Thanks, Paul. I know here in Atlanta, ADAPT has had some very militant and very creative demonstrations. I've been to some of them. And again, just what you talked about, the absolute courage of people who may not be able to see very well or at all, or are in wheelchairs, taking actions, chaining themselves to buses, stopping traffic, etc., to make their point. It's a remarkable thing.
And the lesson for so many pieces of legislation that we have seen passed over the years is that the real credit belongs to the social movements that made those
Absolutely.
laws possible.
Yeah, if there's any lesson to be learned, it is that Congress doesn't make any law that's good for the people unless the people have really raised a lot of HELL out on the streets. So thank you so much for that. And I believe that Alan is on the line.
Yes, I am.
Oh, thank you so much for taking time out. So, listeners, we are speaking with Alan Menjivar, and he is with the American Postal Workers Union. He's calling from Chicago, although he himself is from California. He is an organizer of the Staples campaign on the West Coast, and we asked Kenyon Beasley, who is at the convention as well, to have somebody call in and give us an update on the Staples campaign, because the internet was full of information that Staples had backed off of its attempt to put post offices in their stores staffed by the low-wage Staples workers, and thus help support the management of the post office to close down our local post offices and throw, how many hundreds or thousands of workers out of a good paying job. So, Alan, if you wouldn't mind giving us just a tiny background about the Staples this idea of having offices in Staples stores, and then tell us really what happened.
Yes, absolutely. In San Francisco Bay Area, we have 29 stores, Staples stores, and out of the 29 stores, 2 of them went out of business within the first 6 months of the pilot program. The pilot program started back in January to the present, and now they're coming out and saying that they're withdrawing from the pilot program, and pretty much it's not true. It's not true at all. They're only changing the name to Approved Cheapers Program. Staples will continue providing services to the people of this country and providing postal services, and it is actually the first step towards privatization of the postal service. And just to give you a background, what we're doing in the Bay Area is that we are protesting 10 protests per week. We have a total of 140 to the present, and we are going very strong. We're averaging between 19 and 24 people per protest, just to send a very strong message to the people of this country that we are totally against privatization, and we intend to win this fight.
So, Alan, if I could ask, so why do you think Staples and the post office put out this big old press release and made this big to-do that they had decided not to do this?
It's actually to confuse the people of this country. They want to derail the whole issue, and they want to confuse. They want to send a different message that they're not in the business anymore, but in fact they will continue. This pilot program will transition into something else, and the something else is the Approved Cheapers Program. And again, they will continue providing the services as they're doing right now. So it's actually a lie. They're lying, and it's not something that is not going to go away until we actually win this fight.
Okay, but I want to get to this point that the campaign is what forced them to lie.
Right. Basically, what happened was we were in Los Angeles last week for the ATF convention, the American Teachers Federation, and actually they passed a resolution to endorse our campaign, the Staples campaign. So ATF is one of our allies right now, and they are boycotting the Staples. So none of the teachers are buying anymore at Staples. So pretty much our boycott right now is also to send a message that not to buy at Staples. So they're very concerned about that. So based on that new alliance that we have with the ATF, they changed their mind from a pilot program to the Approved Cheapers Program, but only to confuse the whole issue.
It has been reported here on the Labor Forum about the teachers being a major component of the Staples sells a lot of supplies to teachers. So very clearly this was a great act of solidarity of the teachers union and a blow against this privatization plan.
Right.
But I'm still wondering what it is that they're going to be doing that has any difference from what the pilot program was.
No one really knows exactly. All they did was announce the fact that they are withdrawing from the pilot program and they're going into the approved cheapers program through, I believe they're going to start it on August 29th of this year. But no one really knows exactly what the change will be. But we are assuming that they're going to continue with the services, but the same services they're providing right now.
I thought I saw something online about, and it had the word shipping or shippers in it.
Right. But exactly, there are, again, they're confusing the whole issue. We don't know exactly what they're actually going to be doing, but we do know that they're still going to be providing the same services as they are providing right now.
Okay, so for our listeners, to make this clear, again, what was happening was that the post office management, who has an eye towards privatization, you should understand how much money, in fact, the post office makes. Do you know the exact figure, Alan?
No, I don't.
Anyway, it's in the millions, billions of dollars that the post office actually makes, and without having to pay this onerous let's see, how do I even describe this? The post office is required to pay the retirement costs of workers that haven't even been hired yet.
Exactly. It was something that it was imposed in 2005, 75 years of pre-funding the retirement. People that have not been born yet on a 10-year window. And pretty much that's what actually caused the financial crisis. So in other words, if you're imposing this amount of money to pay up front, you're going to be forced to go, pretty much fabricated to go into, some kind of financial hardship. So that what actually started all these problems, claiming that they don't have any money, that, they have to find other ways to survive and things like that. And that's how they merged into the pilot program with Staples. But in reality, how can you impose this amount of money of billions, $5.5 billion, 75 years in advance for on to be paid on a 10-year window is totally unreal.
What is your message to our listeners about how they can be supportive to your campaign?
The message that I would like to send out is this: if there is any protest in your area, try to be part of the protest. Let's stay together as units, and let's not buy up Staples into actually Staples, start selling their supplies and stay out of the postal business.
One of the points that we've had raised many times here, of course, is this is not anything derogatory about the character of Staples workers. But this is a store which hires workers at very low wages and with very little training, obviously, and all the intricacies and regulations of either how you send mail or how the postage for mail, etc. And the big difference, of course, being that postal workers take an oath to protect our mail, to have it be secure. And obviously, Staples workers, no matter how well-intentioned they are not trained in this. And so you're really taking a risk. I think that's the thing I'd like to point out, that you really take a risk, because it has been pointed out to us here on this station by Kenyon Beasley, who's the campaign organizer, or one of the campaign organizers here in Atlanta, that until a postal worker picks up that mail, there's no guarantee to it.
Exactly, and that is exactly right. And one thing that I want to point out, Diane, is that for a postal worker to work at the window, it requires 40 hours on the classroom training and 32 hours on the job training. So, you can compare the quality of service a postal employee can provide versus the quality of service Staple employees can provide. We have nothing against the Staple employees, but again, we are concerned about the sanity and the security of the mail.
It seems to me that what this whole thing with Staples should have could result in is that Staple workers themselves should now join the campaign for at least the $15 minimum wage, because they are, as so many retail workers are, totally underpaid.
Exactly.
Would you mind giving us a website or another way for people to get more information? And particularly because, as I said, when I turned my computer on, there it was all over the internet about how victory, Staples is pulled out. And it was only when postal worker friends of mine said, hold everything.
Right. There are two ways to get a lot of information on what it is, what's going on right now, through our American Postal Workers Union website, apw.com, or you can go into stopstaples.com. Both sites can give you the information that is actually happening, and will give you a summary of our national convention here in Chicago, exactly what other issues are being discussed right now.
Do you mind if I ask you a little bit about that, about what's happening at your convention?
Here, every 2 years, we have a national convention, and the national convention, it actually consists of resolutions to actually move forward, to change the contract, collective bargaining agreement, to change a lot of things to improve our union. And basically today is the first day of our national convention. They are in session right now, and we'll know exactly what the end of the results of the resolution by the end of the week.
Can I ask how many people are there, if you know?
We have 2,200 registered for this convention. 2,200 registered APW members from all over the nation.
I want to thank you, Alex.
And one thing that I'd like to point out is that we're having a protest tomorrow in front of Staples here in Chicago at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Between 3 o'clock and 4:30 in the afternoon, we're going to be protesting in front of Staples on Wabash and Washington Street. Anybody that is listening from Chicago area can come over and help us out and protest, and again, to send a very strong message of solidarity that the U.S. mail is not for sale.
So, Alan, thank you so much for being on the Labor Forum today. We really appreciate this update. And may I ask another question about your convention? Is your president elected at this convention, or is that another time?
No, this is actually the new president, Mark Dimison, is the first convention that is holding today. So we are very pleased. We have a different vision, and our vision, again, is about the alliance with the other unions and actually build a very strong movement to reinforce the good living wages and actually protect the jobs of the people of this country.
Thank you again so much, and good luck with your convention, and particularly good luck tomorrow. We wish we could be there. All of us here at the Labor Forum have participated in the demonstrations at the Staples stores in the Metro Atlanta area.
Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Alan.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So we are waiting for our telephone call from California, where we're going to talk about how it is that we can achieve solidarity among the various segments of our community, the different unions, and as was mentioned, the folks from the disability community, women, et cetera. So we are, as I said, waiting. So Paul, on the piece of history that you gave, is there anything you else wanted that you edited out?
I think the thing that's real important to understand about the disability rights movement is they don't get the recognition from a lot of... I can give a perfect example of a labor conference I went to where we were bringing people from Atlanta, from the disability community, and just the question of access to the conference floor was not something that had been thought about in advance. And so there's a sensitivity and a level of awareness that the rest of the movement needs to have in order to be inclusive of people who have a very militant tradition in their own right and bring a lot to the table in terms of their traditions. For example, one of the things I really love about their culture and their philosophy that I've seen is a slogan that I think originated in South Africa called, and it's "Nothing about us without us." And that's a real sign that this is a movement that's run by the people most affected. and not by advocates and people who may have good intentions. But when it comes to decision making and strategizing, the people at the table are those that are most affected by the issues.
Thanks for that. So Teresa Gutierrez is on the phone. Let me ask my engineer, Chris, whether we have to play this PSA and promo first. Nope. Okay. Hey, Teresa, how are you?
How are you? Fine. How are y'all? Thanks a lot for the invitation.
Okay, so Teresa Gutierrez is a coordinator and actually I think a founder, co-coordinator and a founder of the May 1st Coalition for Immigrant and Worker Rights, which is in New York City. That was founded, about 8 years ago?
It was formed actually in 2006.
Okay.
So, yeah, it's about 8 years. Yes.
So the reason Teresa's on the phone with us today is in this last half hour, we've been trying to have deeper conversations about the critical needs of working people, the labor movement, in our last half hour of our labor forum programs, now that we have this extended period of time to talk about the real crisis in some respects that working people all across the world face. And so in July, we started off talking a lot about independence and what freedom meant and all the things that get ballyhooed so much with the 4th of July holiday. And one of the things that struck us is that we're in a right-to-work state. Many other states are in right to work, and that essentially says that each worker is on their own. They don't need a union, and it's a blow against solidarity. And so today we really wanted to talk about how to achieve solidarity among various sectors of the working class when the culture in the United States really promotes, the rugged individual, do it yourself, you're responsible for yourself, kind of an ethos. But on the other hand, everything about the economy is globalized. Capitalism doesn't really allow for much individual freedom, no matter what they say. So that's why we invited Teresa, because of her experience with the May 1st Coalition for Immigrant and Worker Rights in melding together issues impacting immigrants, impacting workers in unions and non-organized workers into a cohesive fighting force. How about that for an introduction, Teresa?
Well, that sounds great.
All right, so my co-host here is Paul McLennan, and so that's kind of what we wanted to start off with. If you would talk a little bit about how it is that you see and the May 1st Coalition sees, not just kind of the obvious rational need for this kind of unity, but really, how does it get done? That seems to be the big issue everywhere. How do we do it?
Right. Well, I definitely think this is one of the most important issues to discuss today. And with all that is going on in the world, whether it's children and youth and other Palestinians who are being bombed, or whether it's the children and youth who are being, quote unquote, welcomed by racist, reactionary, conservative, anti-immigrant forces on the border and elsewhere in the United States, what is it going to take to win justice for all the people who need justice? Or whether it's, people who had the water cut off on them in Detroit. The issues are so grave and so big that it's important for us to connect the struggles. It's important for us to build solidarity with all the different issues. And so I think that, I'm a long-time activist, and one of the things that I so get inspired about our coalition is that we are a very diverse coalition. We have members of the Coalition for Black Trade Unionists as part of our group. We have immigrants from several parts of Latin America. We have white activists. We have, anti-war activists. It's a very broad coalition, which is interesting, right? And the test of whether a coalition is or a movement is making ground is when there are differences, and there are passionate differences. The test that is passed, however, is when people come back to the table the next day, when they come back to the demonstration, when they support the other issues. And that's the beauty, I think, of our coalition. And it has been extremely honest and extremely frank discussion about our issues and our passions that are different. But what unites us is that we want to see progress for workers and oppressed people. That's what unites us. And so even if, this union or this immigrant, would like to have a different emphasis or a different language, what brings us back together the next day is that whatever the differences are, we want change and we want progress. And we are willing to come back together again, to unite around that demonstration or unite around that call in order to make progress. And so, when a movement is alive and real and genuine, you will have these kinds of discussions, you will have these kinds of passions, and you will talk out the differences and you'll make gains. I remember I was very touched years ago when the movement and the war in Iraq started in '91, and there were some lesbian and gay activists that were organizing around Iraq, and they were doing outreach to the lesbian and gay movement. And one of the Iraqis that was around the movement there, one day came to a lesbian and gay meeting, and he came up to the meeting and talked and was basically in tears and was apologizing for all his homophobic attitudes in the past. And he said, I had no idea, I have learned so much. Thank you for fighting for Iraq. And I think that's an example of how in the struggle, when you're in the struggle for social change, the kinds of differences that the powerful want to evoke in society, the kind of differences that get promoted in the media and elsewhere, just disappear in the struggle for social change and the struggle for peace and prosperity and so forth. And so I think that's a great example of even though there's divisions and even though there's problems, they will disappear as we engage in the struggle. So right now, I do want to take the opportunity to say that the May 1st Coalition and others have put out a call to have a caravan of material aid that will go along the East Coast and converge in South Texas to be able to welcome these children and young people and bring material aid. And we very much would like to stop in Atlanta. And so I want to put a plug in for that while I have a chance. And I think that, I'm very heartened by the many demonstrations for Palestine that have taken place, not only in the United States and around the world. They're huge, and we really need to encourage everyone to come out to these actions. And it is so important to connect the struggles. We really have no other choice.
I really appreciate what you were saying about working with the tensions in a coalition. There's the best thing quote I've ever seen about working in coalitions is from Bernice Johnson Reagan, who was active with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the 60s and became a founding member of the group Sweet Honey in the Rock. And she says that you're not in a coalition if you feel comfortable.
Very, very well said. Very well said.
And if all you've been able to do is gather people in the room who think the same way you do, then it's not a coalition. So I think what you're saying in terms of how working through the tensions is how real unity gets built. It's a real inspiring story.
Yeah.
I wanted to just make a comment about what you said about these, I would call them mobs, at the border with these hateful signs to these children who, from all ages, from tiny to teenagers, who have traveled through unbelievable danger and hardship in an attempt to escape both poverty, but more often the violence that has been perpetuated again, in my opinion, by U.S. policy. And I'll specifically ask you about Honduras.
Okay. Well, yes, Honduras is a perfect example of why these families are forced to bring their children and why so many are leaving their homeland. And this is the sort of thing that we need to tell the Republican Party and the Tea Party elements that are dominating the agenda on this issue. If they really didn't want immigrants to come here, then first of all, they wouldn't have passed economic policies like NAFTA. And in most recent developments, when the president of Honduras in 2009, Mel Zelaya, was president, he was trying to carry out economic and social policies that would raise the standard of living for the Honduran people. He wanted to nationalize many of its resources, raise the minimum wage, this sort of thing. And he was aligning himself with the wave of progressive movement that was happening in Venezuela and elsewhere in Latin America. And Mel Zelaya was ousted. He was overthrown by a pro-rich elite element that was supported and backed by the U.S. government. And a wave of oppression then began in Honduras. And since 2009, 25,000 people have been killed, beaten, assassinated, threatened, and so forth. So there is a bloody war going on in Honduras that must be talked about. And these are the roots of the migration of children and youth and families from Honduras. And so it is part of U.S. foreign policy. These children are basically refugees from war, whether it's a drug war or whether it's policies such as that of Honduras. And so they should not be deported. They should be given legal representation, and they should be treated as war refugees, as even, elements of the United Nations have called for.
Teresa, I'm sorry.
Yes.
We have to take a short break, and if you just stay on the line, we'll be right back with Teresa Gutierrez of the May 1st Coalition for Immigrant and Worker Rights here on the Labor Forum. We're back here on the Labor Forum, and our guest on the line is Teresa Gutierrez with the May 1st Coalition for Immigrant and Worker Rights, which is based in New York City. Teresa, again, thank you for taking time out to talk with us today. I think I would be interested if you could be a little more specific about how this coalition, which is immigrants, which are largely, obviously we say immigrants are part of the working class, they're workers, and then worker rights. So how is it that the name came? And then could you talk a little more specifically about some of the tension that you talked about and how it really got solved practically?
Well, I think that one of the reasons why our coalition has survived, because many coalitions come and go, and it's understandable, and difficulties and issues change and so forth. But most of us, part of the reason why we come back to the table over and over again is that we understand who the real enemy is, and it isn't those of us who are in the streets fighting for rights. It's really the government and Wall Street and so forth. And so we try to remind ourselves, like, so-and-so's not the enemy. Even that person might have said something not friendly to women or didn't quite get, the issue on immigrants. We remind ourselves over and over, well, the Wall Street gains if our coalition falls apart. And everyone remembers that and continues in the fight. But in the very beginning, one of the passionate discussions was which would go first, worker or immigrant. And of course, the folks in the unions were like, it's got to be workers. And the people who were more concerned about the immigration issue or who were immigrants said, no, it's immigrants. And we spent hours on that. And we agreed, that, well, we're all workers, so let's put that first. Whether you're an undocumented, whether you were born here or not, you're a worker. So finally, after hours of this, we agreed that let's put workers first. But had we not had union sisters and brothers at the table, we might not have even remembered to put in workers. We might have just left it to May 1st Coalition for Immigrant Rights. And so it was one of those examples where New York was very fortunate to have union activists. And I need to say why this coalition was formed. We all remember that in 2006, millions of undocumented workers and their supporters took to the streets, and it was the first upsurge of low-wage workers in recent history. Because if you immigrants were fighting for immigrant rights, but above all, they were low-wage workers without papers, of course. And in that period, they wanted to march on May Day, and around the world, workers march on May Day, and it's no big thing. Even though May Day originated in the United States, for decades it had been dormant in this country, and unions primarily marched on Labor Day, September. And some of the unions resisted marching on May Day in New York City, and I won't call them out, not necessary, but they felt like it was a little bit too much, that it was evoking, for some reason, the communist march on May Day. And it became sort of a red baiting issue, unfortunately. But there was some in New York City who felt, well, we're going to march on May 1st. It's Workers' Day. How can we not march? And so a new coalition was formed, and that's why it's called the May 1st Coalition. And the unions that we work with, many of the union activists, if not all of them, or most of them anyway, happen to be African American. And that was because they are with the Million Worker March perspective of the union movement. And many of them are members of the Million Worker March movement. And that was very important to the Latino immigrants in the coalition. It was very important for Latinos to be in solidarity with the Black struggle. And our Black union members often raised the issues that were pertinent to the Black community. And that was extremely important to the Latino activists in our coalition. And it was very natural for us, for example, to go march for Sean Bell, one of the African-American youth that was killed by the NYPD. And it was a very beautiful thing to see many immigrant rights organizations at that demonstration in New York City. And I think that's true, really around the country. I think that maybe there are some organizations who don't necessarily, get that extra push. But many do see the importance of aligning themselves with the Black community and coming out against police brutality, because many immigrants, of course, experience serious police brutality as well. So these are the kinds of issues that, were elevated, that were talked about, that, sort of sealed the unity in the coalition despite differences, And it was one example of how a test arose and everyone passed the test, to link these struggles together. And I think that's sort of glued with the glue that kept the coalition together.
Teresa, could you talk about your experience across immigrant groups? For example, we have an organization here, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, that focuses a lot on immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean and South America, Afro-Latinos. Have you had experience with trying to bridge different immigrant groups?
Well, we do have that experience. I think that one of the, conditions are difficult, and, there's a lot of work and there's many challenges. And one of the lackings, I think, is that there's not enough national coordination. There's, in the United States, there are many, small coalitions or small networks that do carry out some national collaboration, but there's not enough collaboration between all the different groups. So that is one of the weaknesses. But many organizations, there's a group in New York City called the Disabilities Rising Up Movement, DRUM, that, many of these coalitions often get together and have discussions about Black and Brown unity, alliance with the Black community and so forth. And there's a lot of bridges being built all the time. They need to be stronger, and they need to get more active. There's a lot of challenges right now in the movement, but there are good experiences that are there, and we just have to keep building on them.
I think here in Atlanta, the community that is in the streets often and seems to have the most organization is, again, the Spanish-speaking Latino community. But we have here in Atlanta, immigrants and people who were born in every country around the world, with a huge Asian and Indian and just huge communities. And I'm wondering, I think that's what Paul's question was trying to get to, was how is it that you have managed to engage communities? Oftentimes it seems the term immigrant, I think a lot of people, when they hear the word immigrant, they're thinking somebody from Central or South America. So how is it that you have managed to add people from Pakistan, people from, I don't know, wherever else?
The thing that unites our coalition, and not just our coalition, but the other organizations that we work with, like DRUM and other forces, is the anti-imperialist view that we have. And that plays out by talking about the roots of migration. Oftentimes, many groups don't talk about the roots of migration. And when you start talking about the roots of migration, you start talking about U.S. policy. And that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of unity, because then you're sure to talk about Haiti, you're sure to talk about what's going on in Africa, and that builds solidarity, and we make sure that we have forums against the war, that we have forums on police brutality, that we attend all these activities, that we do outreach. Our May 1st program always reflects, one of the criticisms that we get is that the programs are too long, and that's always a challenge. But one of the reasons why it's so long is that we make sure that there's a lot of issues that are reflected, because May Day should reflect, the issues that are pertinent to all the working class. So, we'll have Mumia, we'll have Honduras, we'll have Iraq, we'll have different issues, and that's one of the ways that you build unity. When the movement in New York City, may not necessarily agree that we get criticisms, for example, that we work too closely with the unions, and part of that is because there's a historical negative experience that many immigrants have with unions, right? And we try to overcome that. We try to say, well, workers need unions. And yes, there might have been some mistakes, but that doesn't mean that, we shouldn't fight to build unions. And these groups that don't agree with working with unions still come to May Day. And they come to May Day, and they come to Union Square in particular, because they know that at Union Square, which is where our rally is held every year, we are uncompromising on the issues for immigrants. And I think that helps build unity. We never talked about comprehensive immigration reform because that was a bogus formulation. John McCain from Arizona was talking about comprehensive immigration reform. We talked about legalization. We weren't blurring the issue with a formulation that was ambiguous, that was for militarizing the border, that gave legalization for some. That was what comprehensive immigration reform was all about. We stood fast consistently for the demand on legalization. And so these are the kinds of things that sort of help build and advance the struggle, because, even if they didn't agree, with working with unions, or if they didn't understand why we would talk about MOMIA on May Day, they did know that we were solid on the immigration issue. And so this brought unity. It brought unity because they knew that we were consistent, and so therefore they were willing to come and participate and learn and hear about unions and hear about other struggles. And it became, it's part of our reputation, that we're consistent with the issues that are for unity and uniting the different forces, even if folks don't understand why. Sooner or later they do understand why. So therefore,
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. We have like a few seconds left of the program. We want to thank you, but we want to give you one more chance to mention this caravan, and if anyone who's listening is interested in that, how they can get in touch.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. This is a very important discussion. It should be happening across the country, all over. In the next 2 weeks, we will be meeting with Pastors for Peace and other organizations to carry out a caravan of material aid and travel down to the South Texas border. And we hope to stop in Atlanta and meet with people, pick up some aid, pick up some support. We want to unite all the different struggles, so important. And if anybody does want to work on this caravan, they can visit our website, may1.info, or they can call 917-328-6470. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Teresa. We are out of town. Listeners, please tune in again next Monday for the Labor Forum.